The transport ship passed through the Chesapeake Bay on a grey morning in March 1943, and from the hold below deck, the German prisoners could hear the sounds of America for the first time. Seagulls crying, distant foghorns. The engine's pitch changing as the vessel reduced speed. They had been at sea for 11 days, crossing an Atlantic still infested with U-boats, though this time the submarines were hunting for them, not protecting them. Most of the men were from Rommel's Afrika Korps, captured when their positions in Tunisia had finally collapsed under the weight of Allied air superiority and endless American supplies. They sat in silence, each man alone with his thoughts, preparing for what came next. The propaganda lectures had been explicit about American treatment of prisoners. They would be used for hard labor, the lectures had said. They would be subjected to harsh conditions, retribution for German military success. Food would be minimal, shelter basic, treatment cold and impersonal. Some of the older soldiers, veterans who had fought in the First World War, whispered darker warnings based on their own memories of imprisonment. One sergeant, a man who had been captured by the French in 1918, told the younger soldiers to expect hunger, to expect cold, to prepare themselves mentally for degradation. As the ship's engines cut and they heard the clang of dock lines being secured, each man steeled himself for the ordeal ahead. What they encountered in the 72 hours that followed would fundamentally challenge everything they believed about their enemy, about themselves, and about the nature of the war they had been fighting. The first processing center was a converted warehouse in Virginia, and the initial experience matched their expectations. They were lined up, counted, searched, issued numbers, photographed. The American soldiers conducting the processing were efficient, professional, neither friendly nor hostile. The Germans responded with the discipline that had been drilled into them, following orders, maintaining military bearing, giving only name, rank, and serial number as the Geneva Conventions required. They were issued uniforms, American-made, but dyed to distinguish them from U.S. military clothing. The trousers and shirts were new, heavy cotton, well-made. This was the first small surprise. They had expected cast-off rags, worn and inadequate. These were quality garments, better than what many of them had worn in North Africa, where supply lines had been stretched thin and uniforms had deteriorated under desert conditions. But it was a small thing, easy to dismiss. They were herded into a mess hall, and that was when the first real shock occurred. On metal trays, they were served a meal, beef stew with actual chunks of meat, white bread with butter, canned fruit and coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt grain substitute they had been drinking for 2 years. The portions were not small. A young corporal from Dusseldorf, a machinist before the war who had been drafted in 1941, stared at his tray with an expression somewhere between disbelief and suspicion. "This is a trick," he whispered to the man next to him. "They're fattening us up before they put us to work." But an older Feldwebel, a career soldier who had learned to read situations quickly, shook his head slowly. "If this is a trick, it's an expensive one," he said quietly. "Look at what they're feeding themselves." He nodded toward the American guards, eating at a separate table. Their meals were nearly identical to what the prisoners had been served. The same stew, the same bread, the same coffee. The Americans were not eating better than their prisoners. They were eating the same food. This observation rippled through the group, whispered in German from table to table. What kind of enemy feeds its prisoners the same rations as its own soldiers? The question had no answer within the framework they had been given. So they ate, hesitantly at first, then with the desperate hunger of men who had been on reduced rations for months. And when they finished, when they sat back with full stomachs for the first time in longer than some could remember, they began to sense that something fundamental about their understanding was wrong. They didn't yet know what, but the first seeds of doubt had been planted. The train journey inland took 2 days, and through the windows, the German prisoners saw an America that bore no resemblance to the images their propaganda had shown them. They had been told America was weak, its industry faltering, its people soft and divided. What they saw from those train windows was a nation humming with industrial power. Factories stretching for miles, smokestacks rising like forests, rail yards crammed with freight cars, highways filled with automobiles. In the cities they passed through, they saw no bomb damage, no rationing queues, no signs of hardship. People on the streets looked well-fed, well-dressed, going about their lives as if there were no war at all. The contrast with Germany was profound and troubling. By 1943, every German city bore scars from Allied bombing. Rationing was severe. Civilian morale was strained. Yet here was America, 3,000 miles from the fighting, completely untouched. Its industrial capacity so vast that it seemed to mock everything they had been told about the weakness of democracy. One lieutenant, an engineering graduate from Munich who had believed completely in German technological superiority, did mental calculations as he watched factory after factory slide past the window. The scale was impossible. If America could build this much, could produce this freely, then how could Germany possibly win? He said nothing aloud, but the question gnawed at him, and he was not alone in his thoughts. They arrived at Camp Clarinda, Iowa, on a cold evening, and were marched through gates into a compound that looked nothing like they had imagined. The barracks were wooden structures, newly built, with tar paper roofs and glass windows. Inside, each building was divided into rooms, housing 8 men, not open bays crowded with dozens. Each man had a metal frame bed with a mattress and springs, not a straw pallet on bare ground. There were blankets, 2 per man, thick wool in good condition. The barracks were heated with coal stoves that actually had fuel. The latrines were in separate buildings but winterized, with plumbing that worked with sinks and hot water. One private, the youngest in his group at barely 19, sat on his assigned bunk and pressed his hand against the mattress, testing its firmness. "My bunk in the Hitler Youth Camp was harder than this," he said, and there was no humor in his voice, only confusion. An older soldier, a baker from Hamburg, who had fought in France and Russia before Africa, walked slowly around the room, examining everything with a professional eye. He had been a prisoner of the French in the last war, had spent 2 years in a camp that was barely more than a fenced field with tents. He knew what prisoner conditions could be. This was not that. This was better than many military barracks he had slept in. He turned to the others and said quietly, "Whatever they told us about America, they were wrong. We need to accept that and adjust our thinking accordingly." It was a brave thing to say, a dangerous thing even among comrades, because it implied that the party had lied. But no one contradicted him. They were all thinking the same thing. The first full day began with reveille at 6, and the men lined up for inspection, expecting harsh treatment, demanding discipline, the familiar rituals of military dominance. What they got instead was a bored American sergeant who counted them, checked that they were reasonably clean and presentable, and dismissed them to breakfast without ceremony. The mess hall was warm, the food abundant. Oatmeal with brown sugar and milk, not the thin gruel they had expected. Scrambled eggs, real eggs, not powdered. Toast and jam, more coffee. The German non-commissioned officers tried to maintain order, to keep their men in line, to preserve military structure, but it was difficult when every expectation was being violated. After breakfast, they were assembled in the compound yard, and an American officer, speaking through a translator, explained the camp rules. They would be expected to keep their quarters clean. They would follow a schedule. They would be assigned work details, as permitted by international law. In return, they would be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. Medical care would be provided, meal privileges would be granted, recreational facilities were available. And then the officer said something that caused a stir of disbelief. Religious services would be held each Sunday, and attendance was voluntary, but transportation to local churches could be arranged for those who wished to attend. Catholic, Protestant, or other denominations as needed. The Germans looked at each other in confusion. Church, they would be allowed to attend church. In an enemy country, as prisoners of war, they would be permitted to practice their religion. It made no sense within the ideological framework they had been taught, where religion was viewed as weakness, where the party had systematically tried to replace Christian faith with racial mythology. Yet here was the enemy, the supposedly godless Americans, offering to take them to church. That first Sunday, 27 prisoners requested permission to attend Catholic Mass in the nearby town of Clarinda. They were loaded into a truck, accompanied by 2 guards who carried rifles but seemed more bored than vigilant. The church was a modest building with a white steeple, and when the Germans entered, uncertain and self-conscious in their marked prisoner uniforms, they were met with something entirely unexpected. The congregation did not recoil. The people did not glare with hatred. Instead, several elderly women smiled at them, nodded welcomingly, gestured to empty pews. The priest, an Irish-American who spoke no German, conducted the Mass in Latin, the universal language of the church. And for 1 hour, those German prisoners were not enemies, not soldiers, not prisoners. They were simply Catholics, participating in a ritual that connected them to something larger than the war, larger than nations, larger than ideology. When they knelt to pray, some of them wept quietly, heads bowed, overcome by emotions they could not name. After the service, the congregation invited them to a social hour in the church basement. There was coffee, real coffee, and cookies that local women had baked. People approached them cautiously but kindly, attempting conversations in broken German or through gestures. One old farmer, discovering that a German prisoner was from Bavaria, spent 10 minutes excitedly explaining that his own grandfather had emigrated from a village near Regensburg. He showed the prisoner a faded photograph he carried in his wallet, a family portrait from 1880. The prisoner stared at the photograph, at faces that looked like his own relatives, and felt the foundations of his worldview shifting beneath him. The routine of camp life established itself over the following weeks, and with it came a growing awareness among the prisoners that their treatment was not an aberration, not a temporary propaganda gesture, but standard policy. The food remained abundant, the shelter remained adequate, medical care, when needed, was provided promptly and competently. A prisoner who developed appendicitis was taken to the local hospital, operated on by an American surgeon, and recovered in a clean ward before returning to camp. Another prisoner, suffering from chronic malaria contracted in Africa, received quinine and proper treatment until his symptoms subsided. The Americans seemed to regard prisoner health as a logistical problem to be solved efficiently, not as an opportunity for punishment or neglect. This attitude permeated everything. When a heating stove in one barracks malfunctioned, it was repaired within 24 hours. When the shower facilities proved inadequate for the number of men, they were expanded. The camp commander, a colonel who had been a high school principal before the war, conducted regular inspections and actually asked the German officers if there were problems that needed addressing. This was so foreign to their experience that many prisoners initially suspected it was a trick, a way to identify troublemakers. But no punishment ever followed from complaints. Issues that were raised were, more often than not, actually resolved. It was administrative competence applied to prisoner welfare, and it was unlike anything they had experienced in their own military. The psychological impact of this treatment was profound and destabilizing. These men had been raised in a system that glorified hardness, that viewed compassion as weakness, that measured strength by the capacity to inflict and endure suffering. They had been taught that Germany was strong because Germans were hard, disciplined, willing to sacrifice. And they had been taught that America was weak because Americans were soft, pampered, unwilling to endure hardship. Yet here they were, imprisoned by this supposedly soft enemy, and they were being treated with a baseline decency that many of them had never experienced in their own army. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. Some prisoners retreated into denial, insisting that the treatment was a trick, that the Americans were softening them up for some sinister purpose. These men clung to Nazi ideology, organized themselves into hardcore groups within the camps, pressured other prisoners to maintain loyalty to the Reich, but others, particularly younger soldiers who had been drafted late in the war, began to question. If the Americans were weak, why were they winning? If German racial superiority was real, why were they the ones behind barbed wire? If the cause was just, why had they been lied to about so many things? The questions multiplied, whispered in barracks after lights out, discussed cautiously among trusted comrades, eating away at the certainties that had sustained them. The Sunday church services became, for many prisoners, a lifeline to a moral framework that existed outside the Nazi system. In church, they reconnected with values that had been systematically suppressed: humility, compassion, forgiveness, the intrinsic worth of every human soul. The American congregations that welcomed them, despite the uniforms, despite the war, embodied a kind of Christianity that had been nearly extinguished in Germany, where the churches had largely either collaborated with the regime or been silenced. Here, in small Iowa towns, in Kansas, in Nebraska, German prisoners encountered Americans who took their faith seriously enough to extend charity even to enemies. After several weeks of attending services, one German prisoner, a former Hitler youth leader who had believed completely in the racial doctrines he had been taught, approached the priest after Mass through a translator. He asked a question that had been tormenting him. "How can you be kind to us? We are your enemies. We have killed your sons. We represent everything you oppose. Why do you not hate us?" The priest, an old man who had buried 3 boys from his parish already in this war, was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Because my faith teaches me that you are not my enemy. You are my brother who has been led astray. And my duty is not to hate you, but to help you find your way back." The German prisoner could not speak. He simply nodded and walked away, but that conversation stayed with him for the rest of his life. And decades later, in interviews conducted by German historians, he would say that it was the moment his real re-education began, not through propaganda or re-education programs, but through simple Christian witness. As winter gave way to spring in 1944, the prisoners at Camp Clarinda settled into a routine that bore less and less resemblance to imprisonment and more to something like a strange, suspended existence. They worked on local farms, helping with planting, and were paid a small wage in camp scrip. They played soccer in the compound yard on Sunday afternoons, organized by the prisoners themselves with American approval. They received mail from home, letters that took months to arrive, but that provided precious connection to families and a Germany that was increasingly unrecognizable in their descriptions. The letters spoke of bombing, of shortages, of war weariness, and the contrast with their own relatively comfortable existence in Iowa was jarring. They were eating better than their families. They were safer than their families. They were, in some ways, living better than they had lived before the war. This inversion of expectations was deeply troubling. They were supposed to be suffering for the fatherland, enduring hardship as prisoners of war. Instead, they were gaining weight, sleeping in heated barracks, attending church, playing sports, and being treated with a decency that made them question everything they had believed about the fundamental nature of the conflict. The American Guards, for their part, treated the whole situation with characteristic pragmatism. They were not cruel, but neither were they sentimental. They did their jobs, which was to keep the prisoners secure and healthy, and they did those jobs with the same matter-of-fact competence they would bring to any task. Many of the guards were older men, 4F or beyond draft age, and they had no particular animosity toward the Germans. Some, as noted earlier, had German ancestry themselves and spoke the language. They traded cigarettes with the prisoners, showed them photographs of their families, discussed farming techniques or machinery repair. They were not trying to win hearts and minds. They were just being themselves. And their natural American informality, their lack of rigid military formality, created an atmosphere that was alien to German military culture. In the Wehrmacht, there had been strict separation between ranks, elaborate protocols, formal distance. The American Guards called their officers by rank, but spoke to them with a casualness that seemed almost insubordinate to German eyes. Yet the system worked. Orders were followed. Discipline was maintained. But it was a different kind of discipline. based less on fear and more on pragmatic acceptance of roles. The Germans found this both incomprehensible and oddly appealing. It suggested a kind of social organization they had never experienced, where respect did not require submission, where hierarchy did not require humiliation. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the prisoners at Camp Clarinda and hundreds of other camps across America had undergone a transformation that would only become fully apparent in the decades that followed. They had arrived as soldiers of the Third Reich, believers in German superiority, convinced of their cause's righteousness. They were leaving as men who had seen an alternative, who had been treated with unexpected decency, who had rediscovered moral frameworks that existed outside totalitarian ideology. Not all of them changed. Some remained true believers, returned to Germany bitter and unrepentant. But many, perhaps most, carried back with them seeds of doubt that would blossom into rejection of the Nazi past and embrace of democratic values. They had seen that material abundance and military power could coexist with decency and respect for human dignity. They had experienced a society that was strong without being cruel, organized without being oppressive, victorious without being vengeful. These were the lessons that no propaganda film could have taught, that no re-education program could have imposed. They were learned through daily experience, through hot meals and clean beds and Sunday church services, through 1,000 small acts of basic humanity that added up to something larger than themselves. The American strategy, if it could even be called a strategy, was simply to uphold its own values, to treat prisoners the way Americans believed people should be treated, and to trust that decency would speak for itself. It did. And in the ruins of post-war Germany, former prisoners who had spent years in American camps became some of the strongest advocates for democracy, for reconciliation, for building a new Germany based on different values. They had not been converted by propaganda. They had been persuaded by experience, and that made all the difference.